I remember when I was a kid, I grew up, we had black and white TV until at some point, I don't know, I was 10 or 11, and we finally got a colored television with a remote control, which amounted to one button, which you could push and turn the channels in one direction only in a cycle. Of course, we only got about 5 channels, so that didn't take long. But in the evening, of course, the channels would go off the air, and in Kansas City, we often saw this test pattern in the middle of the night. And so what a nice way to begin this class. Too bad you didn't take it live. There will be a number of these audio lectures, if you will, that go with the slides. Maybe they'll help you answer some quiz questions or review questions. You will have to do a lot of reading on your own. In fact, this picture, the picture of the Indian test pattern, I always thought, somebody told me probably when I was a kid and not paying full attention, I always thought that this was an actual Kansas City creation. But if you go to Wikipedia, lo and behold, there it is with the definition. And I suspect that it is an insignificant enough bit of information that Wikipedia is not trying to fake us out. And I'll go ahead and say that there are a lot of times that you can actually use Wikipedia. It's been cleaned up over the years and is a little more reputable than it used to be. There will be a lot of terms that you might see. There will be questions, there will be phrases, and of course there are lots of old dead people that I'll mention. All of them can be found on the internet. You can Google or Bing or whatever browser you use. You can find information on these people. And I hope that if you enjoy the particular topic or find the person interesting, that you pursue it. And you are certainly welcome to share your discoveries with me and with the rest of the class. Having said that, there are about 25 of you enrolled in the class this semester. There should be, through Moodle, you should find a discussion forum. I'm not exactly sure what we're calling it, but you can go there. You do not need to respond to each other's statements. I know there are a lot of online courses that expect you to carry on conversations with multiple people, and then for me to then be able to use this to justify your grades. I think we probably both have things to do besides trying to meet all of these little these requirements. What I want you to do is get as much as you can out of the material I present, and hopefully you find some of it interesting. And if you do, then please share it with me. You can share it on the group discussion, or you may certainly email me, and I will respond. Please do look at my abbreviated online syllabus. It has my office hours. I encourage you to come by if you can. If you're close enough to the Lincoln campus here in Jefferson City, please do come by and introduce yourself. To this point, I have met one of you online students. Well, let's proceed. All right, this class, of course, is History 206, and it technically begins with the end of the Civil War. And you probably all learned in high school, or perhaps you took History 205, that the Civil War ended in 1865. And I am not going to refight the battles of the Civil War. There are entire classes we offer. We have a great Civil War class offered by Professor Leslie. If you want to look into that, I encourage you to do so. So this class starts with 1865, and ideally we'll get up to modern times. In reality, I suspect we will get into the 1960s. But the first section is called Reconstruction. And the dates you can see right there on the slide, 1865 to 1877. And there are a lot of things that occur in history, both world history and American history, if you will, that we can put dates on. Now, in this case, for example, we know that Reconstruction technically begins or officially begins with the end of the war. And you'll see, or you'll hear me say in a few minutes, that in fact Reconstruction began before the Civil War ended. But we technically in books say that it starts in 1865, and then it ends in 1877. And in this case, fortunately for us, a president of the United States tells us it's over. And so we have a nice, neat little package of an official surrender to a war, and then we have a president telling us in one of his famous speeches, or really not a famous speech, in just one of those presidential speeches, an inaugural address, if you will, that Reconstruction has ended. And that of course, is Rutherford B. Hayes that said that. So the question then is, what is Reconstruction? And that's fairly simple. Most of you are familiar with the fact that it was simply the rebuilding, the reconstructing of the United States. After the Civil War, you still have 11 states, the South, if you will, the Confederacy. You have 11 states that have to be brought back into the Union because, again, each one of them said they quit the Union. They broke the contract with the United States. And so the question then is how do you bring them back into, how do you bring them back in as states into this other group of states? This confederation is gone, and so how do you bring them back into the federal republic? That then takes us to this slide, which is some pictures. Again, all of these pictures are taken from various websites, most all of them that I don't believe I've stolen anything that's terribly significant. If I have, please let me know. Lawsuits, if you're interested in a lawsuit, you'll have to line up at my office door. But these pictures I put together simply to remind us. Of course, you see the tattered flag. And that is just symbolic of what I said, that you've got these various states, of course, represented, as you all know, by the various stars. And there are many different configurations of stars throughout the history of the United States. But the flag represents the need now to put all these stars back together, to put the United States back together. And also I wanted to just remind you that there were lots of different flags during the Civil War. And a lot of times, interesting, unlike, say, World War I or II, you often had flags that were locally made for a group of volunteers. This was a war, certainly unlike World War II, this was a war in which all the men, or a large number of men, might leave a particular community, could be a very small town in Missouri or somewhere else, and they would all go and fight together in a particular regiment or unit. And to be quite frank about it, their wives would sew a number of flags together, or they would sew in the little regimental or company numbers or letters right on the flag, like you can see in that flag. And so that was an interesting facet of the Civil War if you want to look into it. Sadly, however, sometimes a small number of men would all be killed together, and so you might have a large group, a large percentage of men from a particular community who are all together and all fight in the same battle, and unfortunately all meet their death on the same battlefield. So little towns were also occasionally devastated, whereas, for example, in World War II, your soldiers were spread out. And this was, by the way, this was done intentionally, and I believe also in World War I, but there was an intentional attempt to mix soldiers up and not have a large number of soldiers from one town in one particular platoon, company, battalion, or division, if you will. So another interesting story. To the right is what is left of the tallest buildings. I believe that is Richmond, Virginia. And it could also be Atlanta, Georgia, as far as that goes. Two of the largest cities that were in the South. And so part of Reconstruction is the physical reconstruction of cities. And you can certainly imagine that would be a very lengthy, difficult, long process. Perhaps you've seen aerial photographs of the large cities of North Central Europe, Berlin, or other German cities after World War II, for example. So an incredible amount of reconstruction has to be done, literally at the physical level. And of course that includes roads. And the railroads, as you see down there to the left, those that destroyed old locomotive. If you're a railroad person, of course, that was an old 440, which was pretty much the standard size locomotive during the Civil War. 440 meant 4 small front wheels and then 4 large driving wheels that you can see pictured in that photograph. And then, of course, the rest of the locomotive is destroyed. So you have a lot of infrastructure, rail lines, bridges, and things like that also then have to be rebuilt. And for the South, their railroad system was pathetic, to be quite polite about it. They just had not invested in railroads. And the railroad building frenzy in the North was really getting started, and I'll mention it several times later on. But so there's going to be a lot of infrastructure rebuilding. And then the lower right-hand photograph is one of the many different battlefield cemeteries that we have around the United States. I don't remember where this particular cemetery is located, but we have one here in Jefferson City again. So if you're local or if you get a chance to come by, we actually have a Civil War cemetery that's just a few blocks here from our campus that I encourage you to walk through. It's very humbling. But the question that I always like to raise is to students, which is, by the way, seldom covered in books, and that is, how do you reconstruct the lives of the survivors of these dead soldiers? How do you replace the father that is gone, the husband, the son, the brother? How do you replace those? And so Reconstruction also means the reconstructing or the rebuilding of people's lives, both the survivors, the family survivors, but also the soldiers. Again, more work is being done and more research is being done. But what in 1865 they do not have psychologists that the soldiers could go visit with. They don't have opium and alcohol are going to become answers to people who had what we today would call post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder. So if you were a soldier in the Civil War, whether you were in the North or the South, and you had survived, but you had some serious battle fatigue, how do you deal with that? And that's another aspect that is worth thinking about, that is often not discussed in textbooks. Well, let's move on. While Abraham Lincoln was alive, he also realized that the war would be over, the North would win. That was fairly obvious, although there were some questions about that even going right into 1863. But I think anyone who was able to look at the bigger picture realized the South had limited resources. They had a finite amount of just about everything, and the North did not. And so really it was a matter of time before the North would win. Obviously, the sooner the better. But Abraham Lincoln, looking ahead, looking to the end of the war, Lincoln then began to design a plan for bringing the South back into the Union, bringing those 11 states back into the fold, literally inviting them back to Washington, D.C. And we typically just simply give it a label of the 10% plan. So Abraham Lincoln then has a Reconstruction plan, a political, if you will, a political plan. It had really very little, if anything. We would have to look hard to find out if it had anything to do with the physical Reconstruction. He's not going to be dealing with that. In fact, he never obviously lives to see Reconstruction. But nonetheless, his 10% plan was how to bring the southern states back into the federal union. And quite simply, it was this. He was expecting that each state in the South, and I do want to mention, Lincoln wanted to make this a very smooth and a fairly simple transition. He was very, what would be the word? He wanted to do this quickly. He wanted to bring the South back into the United States, and he did not want to make it too painful. So the 10% plan basically was this, that a southern state would acknowledge, how do I want to say this? A southern state a southern state would agree to come back into the Union, and it would be allowed, if you will, to have representation in Congress again, and it would be protected by the Constitution and the federal government after 10% of eligible voters in that state swore allegiance to the United States government. So for example, just pick a state, Louisiana, for example. Once 10% of the voters of Louisiana swore their allegiance back to the United States government and basically to uphold the Constitution of the United States, et cetera, then the entire state, all 100% of the citizens of Louisiana would then be, granted the rights and responsibilities of the United States Constitution, blah, blah, blah. And so that was going to be it. Now, it wasn't well developed, and of course, this is Lincoln thinking, this is Lincoln scratching out his ideas as early as 1863. And so it was fairly lenient, though. Now, what is also worth noting, and I'm sorry, ladies, but what you do have to keep in mind is that in 1863 and 1865, the only eligible voters in any state were men, and to be quite frank about it, in the South, they would have been white males. So that's Lincoln's 10% plan. It was very lenient. It was not really well developed, and then, of course, certainly before Lincoln can begin really pushing the issue, he'll be dead. Footnote that I believe is, if you can correct me if you would like, I believe that is the last photograph of Abraham Lincoln, the last photograph taken of him while he was alive. Contrary to popular belief, contrary to Hollywood, or at least I have never read any primary source documents to show that Lincoln was in fact a vampire hunter. Again, feel free to correct me on that. Now, Lincoln, while of course he had a tremendous amount of support from the American people, and we even have his, we've even got his mug up there in South Dakota at Mount Rushmore. Lincoln did have opposition in Congress, in Washington, D.C., in 1863. There were a lot of people, let me clarify, there were a lot of legislatures who were frustrated that Lincoln had ran the war. And we could argue, you can argue between yourselves if you want about his abilities as commander-in-chief. There obviously are many books on that. But there were a lot of congressmen who believed they had been left out of fighting the war. Lincoln came to them for appropriations bills, typically bills to fight the war. He needs money to fight the war and that business. But Lincoln doesn't call on Congress for suggestions on how to fight it. He just wants them to basically keep the purse strings open and allow him to finance this war. The purse strings, it's a phrase that goes way back in history, in which we often say that Congress has the power of the purse. And that means that Congress has the power to basically, If the White House, if the executive branch has a program or wants something done, it's Congress that funds it, again, through, of course, typically our tax dollars. Well, Benjamin Wade and Henry Davis, who were congressmen, and I'm not going to trouble you with the states they were from, unless you happen to see it again, you can look it up. But these two congressmen did not like the president's Reconstruction plan as it was starting to unfold. And because of their frustration with the executive branch and because they had felt left out of fighting the war, Congress increasingly was feeling like they wanted to at least be in charge of Reconstruction. And so together, Wade and Davis co-authored a bill, which is always a popular thing to do in Congress, to be an author or a co-author. But they co-authored a Congressional Reconstruction Plan, and it's always known simply as the Wade-Davis Bill.